he wanted me to just introduce him as Mike, which that's how I know him. He's quite gracious and fun to get to know. I've really enjoyed, I think I met him at the first ICQA actually, and I'm glad that I did. And also Hazel Vega, who is a graduate student researcher at the IDEA Lab with Golnaz Arastapur Ergens at Clemson University. But they're going to be talking to us today about participatory QE and their own work related to that. So and typically, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we have about 30 minutes of presentation and some discussion, and the last 30 minutes we'll save for more questions and discussion. And we'll save just a little bit of time for some announcements about the upcoming conference and the accelerator training opportunity that I mentioned earlier, and also mention what will be for our last webinar series installment in October next month. But without further ado, I think Hazel's going to kick things off for Hazel and Mike, so I'll turn things over to you.
Okay, can you see my slides? And now the presenter's mode, right? All right, great. Well, thank you everyone for being here. I'm so excited to get to talk to you and with you about some of the work that I've been doing in regards to participatory QE. So yes, I'm gonna go first, and then I'm gonna give the floor to Mike, who's gonna share also very exciting things. So I'm gonna be talking about implications for giving participants a voice in quantitative ethnography. So the way that I look at this is researchers and participants working side by side. And what I mean with this is a borrowed term from Erickson, is that all individuals have the capacity of research and analysis and observations. And we as human beings, we are always in search of that meaning behind our actions. And researchers were in that search for meaning behind data. So, okay, this is not, okay, it's a little behind. So what this looks like is a joint process of co-construction and co-interpretation, and particularly in ethnography, it's about cultures. When we talk about participatory methods, which can be collaborative ethnography or participatory design-based research, participatory action research, and the so many colors that there are out there, we are talking about addressing power hierarchies between the researchers and the participants. And by looking at this, we are not necessarily removing issues of powers, but we're making them more visible. So we can ask ourselves critical questions such as who's researching for whom, and to what end. How I came to think about my research in terms of participatory methods is because I study teachers' identity, and I look at their stories and how they think about their experiences. So I was observing that they shared all of these stories, narratives with me. And as a researcher, my thinking, also my reading of the literature, and the way that I was looking at the data, I saw that it was like in one direction. And I really wanted to know and experiment with what if we change the direction here and we could sort of like construct a back and forth. So one of the ways that I look at this, and I am in this QE community that has been so welcoming and that has allowed me to think about this with the tools and the resources that already has. So it's been great. One of the things that I think about is goals keynotes in ISQE 19. I was not there in person, but I accessed that electronically. I was just starting to know about QE at this point. But what she says about developing new tools to close the gap between theory and practice and approximate these emic and etic perspectives was really powerful. And also one of the things that she mentioned is how we can improve our thick descriptions and how we can confront those biases that we have in data interpretation. In QE, we have the power of computational and human. So what participatory QE really brings to the conversation is strengthening the human. We already have that computational, but we also can do things to improve that human aspect and really look at the tools and develop new ones. Simon has been another member of the community that has allowed me to think about the data visualization tools that we have in QE. And I really like what he mentioned about collaborative sense making, how the affordances of these tools allows researchers and participants to come together for this collaborative sense making. So all of these ideas really make me reflect about the different ways in which we can extend QE and how I can contribute to that. So if I look at the theory and how to involve participants, what we have typically is a suggestion of a continuum between less participatory to more participatory methods. And how we do that, and I've done it through my research, is by establishing trust and practicing listening with participants. That's like the number one step for me. And in addition to that, I've also created new opportunities for roles and also in this continuum, varying levels of participation. And when doing that, leveraging the methods that I bring and the expertise from the participants and myself as well. So what I argue here and in my research is that this efforts for participation has to be more explicit, and we have to bring to the conversation how we're developing these strategies more intentional and along the way of the process of research. So the way that I have done this in my research is involving the voices of pre-service teachers. As I said before, I worked with identity development among English as a foreign language teachers in Costa Rica. The way that I do that is through discourse analysis and mostly interviews that some of you are familiar with already. So I look at identity negotiations, how these participants are adopting, rejecting, or thinking about practices and ideas from their community of practice. I also look at tensions. So my research has identified tensions around the idealized notion of a white native speaker, and also tensions around external expectations from the teaching context that they are starting to encounter in their teaching when they go and observe or practice teaching. So the way that I've done it is interviews with participants with what I call participatory ENA discussions. So I bring the ENA to these interviews. Very briefly, how I do it is write a script to establish that common language and to make accessible some of the terms that we use in ENA. And after that, just the conversation unfolds, and I start to actively listen to what they have to say and their interpretations, but I also leave these open space for questions not only about how ENA works, but also about their own data and how they are understanding their own data. What the main purpose has been is revisiting the connections that they make between the codes that I have previously identified. So I go to this interviews with participants, and this is like the networks that I show to them, which have codes of adoption, rejection, intention. So how they are thinking about some practices, adopting or rejecting, or what we call tension, which is that they're thinking, reflecting about that. So some of the ideas around this is how they feel about accents, if there should be a particular accent that should be in the classroom, about their own language practices, like if they practice code switching, how do they feel about the speaking Spanish and speaking English and being bilingual, and also whether or not they see the native speaker as a standard for teaching and learning English. One of the participants, what she did was to add a connection. So she's a Costa Rican, was born in Costa Rica and raised in Costa Rica, and at the age of 7 came here to the US, learned English as a second language, and then when she was around 17 went back to Costa Rica. So when she looked at her network during this interview, what she said, she noticed, she was surprised, how come I didn't make any connections to accents? Well, it's because really I don't think about it that much. But hey, let me look at my own experience and try to see where that connection may be. So this is what she shared with me during that interview. She says, I can see it in Spanish. When I arrived here in Costa Rica, I thought I spoke Spanish because that's her first language. Because in the US, I was a little bit self-conscious about my accent as a learner. But when I arrived here and I started speaking Spanish, my friends would say, oh, you speak funny in Spanish. So I realized there's accents in every language and there's no right or wrong. So what this missing connection in her network made her realize is that she needs to start thinking more about accents, because accents are real in this larger social structures, really bring all of these language ideologies about how one language should be spoken or not. Another participant reacted to a code. In previous interviews, she made a lot of different comments about her frustrations with her Spanish accent and how she wanted to sound more native-like, but she was not able to attain that, even though she practiced and practiced. That was not possible for her. So she looked at this code of the native speaker as a standard and how the connection to adoption was very strong for her. And she looked at that and said, well, I want to say something about this. And this sparkled her reflection process for her. What she said was, I guess that in the future, when I read your research, I'm going to say, maybe I was being too harsh on myself. I guess that's something that's going to change. Maybe I'm going to come to a closure of not being the best, not being native, or something like that. Basically, although her frustration was very strong, she was not aware that that frustration was sort of like an issue for her and was going to be an issue when she started teaching. When looking at the network and looking that was something very present in her discourse, she said, well, I'm not there yet. I don't think that my frustration is away, but I think that it shouldn't be the case. And probably in the future, this is going to change. So there are a couple of things here that really caught my attention. One was that possibility for reflection. And the other one is imagining that her role as a teacher in the future and how what she was thinking at the moment can change in the future. And that's one of the most powerful things that I found in my own research when sharing these networks with my participants. So unfortunately, I have like more questions than answers about participatory QE. I think when talking about participatory QE, it's more about the unanswered questions, and that's what makes everything more exciting. But I'm also able to see some opportunities that I have here in front of me when I look at the data. So I see that there's opportunities for thicker descriptions, and specifically to identify these gaps. We think that we address the emic and the etic, but by revisiting this with the participants, we can really identify new gaps that can be there and really address those biases that were unnoticed by computational and by human factors. I'm really excited about this collaborative internal, these models when we present them to participants, and we bring them to this collaborative space for cognition, really allows for that extension and that reflection. And that's one of the richest parts of this process. I'm also left with a lot of questions, and I'm just including a few of them here. More to come in the ISQE 2021. I wonder what's beyond DNA, because my work and also Mike's work really is based on ENA, but I'd be interested in knowing what else can we do in addition to, for participatory QE, in addition to using ENA. And the fact that when we go back to the participants and elicit all of this, there's more data. So what do we do with that data? And when doing this, when going back to the participants and involving them in this continuum, how do we negotiate those roles, and how do we allow them to negotiate their own roles? So these are open questions for me that I hope that we can use as discussion points. And now I leave the floor to Mike.
Thanks very much, Hazel. And it's really interesting to see your work. And I always learn stuff every time I see the things that you present. So thank you. One of the things that people like Hazel have done is inspired me to try to work with participants as well. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is trying to make thinking both visible but also contestable for people that I'm working with. Excuse me. And where this really started for me was some work that began about 3 years ago. I actually presented at ISQE 19, where I was working, trying to find out how teachers' thinking and decision-making, knowledge and decision-making kind of intersected. And so I was using ENA to look at teachers' lesson plans. And I was looking at some math, science, and technology or IT teachers. And you can see some visualizations here on this slide for each of those 3 groups of teachers. And what you might notice is that on the right-hand side for the technology or IT teachers, it was completely different to these other teachers. And so I was really surprised by that. And that's what started me actually talking to participants, because I didn't think this was actually representative of these 2 teachers. And so one of the things that when Simon at ISQE talked about QE that actually validates with stakeholders, that really resonated with me, because what I was finding was that my interpretation and etic interpretation of data-based interpretation wasn't resonating with the emic idea that these teachers had about their own practices. So what I really had was this mismatch between what the data was telling me and what my participants were telling me. And I was really wanting to get to this kind of situation where we had a bit more of a similar kind of a perspective on things. And so that work really began some stuff that I've been working on for the last 18 months or so. And it's in a program that's called Leading Virtual Learning. And in Victoria, in Australia, here where I am, we actually have a number of virtual or fully online K-12 schools. And actually our biggest school in this particular state is actually a fully virtual school. And so I've been working with about 100 teachers across the state who work in these schools. It's funded by our local Department of Education. And we run some professional learning to try to enhance certain aspects of these teachers' work. And one of the really interesting things about the way that we've designed this course is we actually have a pre-course interview for everybody that runs for about half an hour. And the idea with these interviews is to get to know these teachers a little bit better, but to also from that start to develop some network visualizations about how they understand their work, so that we can actually create bespoke learning pathways for these teachers throughout the course. So if they're really strong in certain areas, then we're going to give them some more extension kind of work. Or if they're not, then we'll give them some more foundational work. And so these interviews become really important, and we do a post-course interview as well. to reflect back on what teachers have been doing. So this has all been done during the pandemic. So the interviews are recorded via Zoom. We download both the audio and video files, and then we upload them to a tool called Otter AI, which I want to thank two other members of the QE community, Mamta and Marta, for putting me onto. So this is a tool that actually automatically transcribes interview data, and it does it really quickly and is pretty accurate. So we've been using that, and we'll turn around a half-hour interview probably in about 15 minutes. We'll have a transcript of that. So then working with another guy, if you're new to the QE community, you'll probably bump into Zach at some point pretty soon. Zach works with me at Monash. He's a fantastic researcher, and he's been a great colleague and has developed an R package that converts that Otter text file to a CSV file. We upload that to the Web ENA tool, and then Zach's created an R package that simplifies the visualization from the ENA tool. And so Zach is a really big part of actually making this process scalable. And so what we then have done is developed 9 codes, which are a combination of some a priori codes based on course aims and some deductive codes. And there's a little bit more data about, some intercoder reliability and things there. But the thing I want to really draw your attention to is this bottom line, where this guy, Ian Mitchell, who's an RA, he is incredible at coding, and he actually hand codes these interview transcripts at the rate of about 30,000 words per day. So he's done about 500,000 words of coding in this particular project. So we've got a fairly big data set so far. And what that means is that we're actually able to turn these visualizations around really, really quickly. So we're actually able to interview about 7 participants per day. We're able to then get the transcript. We're able to put that into a spreadsheet, Ian codes it, and we're able to then have a visualization within that 24-hour period. And so we're able to then work with those visualizations pretty quickly. So we have 9 codes, as I said, and these are the ways that teachers actually think about their work as in these online spaces. Most of those are pretty self-explanatory and not really important for today's story. But as I said, we put those in, Ian codes them. So the color codes that you can see here are actually representative of segments of text that relate to particular codes. And then what we do is we think about trying to visualize these codes, because this prose is really dense, it's really intimidating, and it's really hard to get into. So we take these codes, and instead of just using an ENA visualization, what we actually did, well, he says what Zach actually did is developed a tool that lays these out in a way that's actually easy to understand in just a circle. So there's no semantic meaning in any of this. There's no meaning in where these codes are located. They're just laid out for visualization. And one of the things that Simon talked about in his ISQE talk was visualizations as cognitive artifacts. And really what we're trying to do here is make this deliberation visible and contestable for stakeholders. So we're not trying to find the right answer, but we're trying to actually involve people in making sense of what this all means. So what we end up with are these kinds of visualizations. This is a visualization that represents one participant in their pre-course interview. And you can see some sort of similarities with the ENA tool in that thicker lines represent stronger connections and weaker lines represent, thinner lines represent weaker connections. We can also do subtraction networks like we do in the ENA tool, where we can see pre and post course for this particular teacher. And one of the other things that we're also able to do is really quickly start to compare across different teachers, and we can start to see some patterns developing as we go through. One of the things that we can also do is look at cohorts. So we can actually look at groups of teachers. So they go through in groups of about 25 in this course, and we can start to see cohort differences as well, both pre and post with this particular tool. So one of the things that we're able to do in really looking at these visualizations really quickly is go from these 9 etic codes to where we think change is actually occurring. And it just so happens that most of them happen to be on the left-hand side of this visualization. But one of the things that's really, really cool, I think, about this project is that we actually take these visualizations back to teachers. We take this layout back to the teachers and we say, tell us what you think this might look like or should look like. And so here's an example of what that looks like in.
So would you like to have a go and show me what you reckon your network map might look like?
And so this teacher then actually starts to annotate over the top. So he's just using the annotation tool in Zoom, and he's drawing and explaining why, but all of a sudden he starts changing color. And we don't do that in ENA. And so we're starting to get an understanding of why he's what he's actually drawing. And then he does this kind of crazy thing as well. So we're getting this really different kind of way that he is thinking about his work. He's thinking about these codes in a really different way that challenged my thinking. And he actually starts to explain why that's the case. These three different colors represent three different parts of his work. The pink one's for things that happen within the school. The green one is all to do with students, and the blue one's all about technology. And as I said, he then does this crazy kind of thing down the bottom here, where being a critic, being a questioning educator, is involved in all of these different things. So the way that he's actually using the tool is completely different to the way that I was thinking about using it. He's really challenging my thinking. We're also able to get other things happening with this tool that we don't necessarily get in the same way in ENA. So here's another teacher who's actually starting to, again, annotate over the top, and she's drawing lines. And what she's actually doing is we get this sense that a lot of these things now start to come from her being a leader in her school. So the leadership component is actually pushing out into these other components. In ENA, we don't necessarily get that sense of direction about how these things necessarily connect to one another. So one of the other commonalities that we tend to get is this kind of thing. So for this particular teacher, what you can see up top left is what she thought was actually going to happen in her teaching. And the blue lines represent what she thought her visualization might have looked like before the course. The red line was what she thought might have changed after the course. What you see bottom right is actually what we got in the pre-course interview. And there's a marked difference between what we got out of her interview and what she thought. And we start to see that happen again and again. Here's another example from another teacher where we have a much, much more complex, richer, sophisticated representation down the bottom of her understanding of her work compared to the way that she sort of thought of her work. And so I'm going to show you when I actually then reveal this to the teacher, have a look at what her reaction ends up being here.
Do you want to see what we were able to get out of your first conversation? So what I'll do, sorry, go on.
No, yes, that would be interesting.
Okay, so I'll bring up behind these coloured lines what we were able to get, and then I'll get rid of those coloured lines so you can see it a bit easier, but we'll do a bit of comparison to start off with. So that's what we got out of that conversation with you. So there's an awful lot more going on, I think, than you might give yourself credit for.
So we're actually able to start then having conversations about what this teacher was thinking and about what was revealed and why there might be these kinds of differences. And we can come to a more shared understanding. So with this particular tool, we're actually then able to combine both the emic and the etic kind of representations and start to see what differences there are and start to talk about those. So there are still a couple of challenges. One of the things, obviously, that we have is kind of the ENA visualization of things as well. And so I'm starting to think about how we might be able to work with all of these different visualizations and bring them together to get a richer kind of perspective of what's going on in different settings. And so one of the things that I've been trying to work out is how we might describe these different kinds of tools. And one of the things that in the team we've been talking about are these simplified visualizations. And I've decided, I think, that I don't necessarily like that word, because the simplified version is actually incredibly powerful. It elicits a whole lot of conversations and a whole lot of meaning that we wouldn't necessarily get by using, well, whatever the opposite to simplify, a more sophisticated tool like ENA. I think if we start to use that kind of language, it's positioning our participants in a particular way, that they can only use simplified tools, whereas we can have these, more sophisticated kinds of tools that we work with. So maybe instead of thinking about simplified and sophisticated, what we might want to do is start to think about emic and etic tools. ways in which we might be able to bring participants into the conversation by using different kinds of tools. Not that they're better or worse, they're just another tool in the arsenal of things that we can use. As Hazel mentioned, this is something that we're particularly interested in, along with a number of other people, including Simon, who's here today. This notion of participatory QE is one that we'll be talking about a little bit more at the upcoming ISQE conference, and we'd love you to join the conversation. So that's what I've been up to, and I hope that's been of some interest.
Thank you to Mike and to Hazel. That was great. So we have some virtual applause and some actual applause if folks want. So we'll open things up now to questions and discussions. But that was a very stimulating set of things that you all shared. I was jotting down a bunch of notes and have my own questions, but I'd like to open things up for others to see what questions or comments folks have for our presenters today. Looks like Rogers. Go ahead, Rogers.
Thanks, Brendan. Thanks, Mike and Hazel, for the interesting presentations. I had a question first for both. Hazel first. I think you're doing very interesting work, and I think you're taking a very interesting approach to QE work. Just referring to some of my own work in my PhD, I've been trying to work with teachers, trying to do like participatory work, also inspired by work by Simon, like human-centered learning analytics, for example, and trying to work with teachers to co-design tools and things like that. And one of the issues you highlighted during your talk was using scripts. Like you use scripts and share them with the teachers. And I wanted to talk about this because during my experience with the teachers, I remember having a script which I was using to guide them in using one of the tools which we co-designed or worked together. But in the end, one of the teachers told me, "Oh, I don't like scripts because the script like takes away control from me." So it was like one of the things about participation is like, okay, it is participatory, but it should also be, I should have like a kind of a freedom to do or to choose what I want to do. And they were like, maybe scripts are more restrictive and they are deciding or they are determining what the researcher should do. So it's something I wanted to know, like how much of the script is it something that you design, also co-design with the teachers, or is it something that you just do on your own and then present to the teachers? And then a question to Mike, it's on the course aims. So it's interesting that when you're doing your coding, you actually did that based on the course aims or course objectives. Something related to what I have done in my own research. And we had a discussion earlier today with David and Brendan about this. And we had a teacher who was part of a course, which I used the course objectives to come up with codes. What I can say is that in my research, I didn't have a discussion prior to coming up with these codes. At a later date, I had to talk with the teachers and share the codes. And so these are the codes we developed. I developed based on the course objectives. And then we had a discussion around this, whether these codes were actually representing the actual objectives of the course. So I don't know how that process was for your case, but still I was still finding it hard to explain that these codes actually show the envisioned kind of design. But I think that's where all this design or participatory approaches come in. So thank you so much, and just look forward to your reflections on those issues.
Thanks, Rogers. They're great questions. I'm happy to jump in first if you like. So, and I can also answer part of Anne's question that was in the chat as well as responding to yours, Rogers. So one of the things that I do before we actually have the interview is that I actually send the teachers a video that goes for about 5 minutes or something like that, where I actually explain what I mean by these codes. And I give them then also a one-page document so that they can actually see that and reflect on that. And one of the things that I do is during the interviews, I actually say to them, do these codes make sense to you? Are there any other things that you think we should be adding in here? And so it's certainly not a static set of codes that we work with, but there are a couple of them that, as I said, that are really important. So the idea of a teacher as a designer and teacher as a critic are two things that we really want to try to get through to these people as part of this course. So they're ones that I kind of am a little bit more protective of, and they're ones that are really important to me. But then the others are absolutely up for negotiation, for sure.
Thank you, Rogers, for the question. So, one of the technical parts of doing this sort of participatory discussions with participants is to be able to make ENA accessible to them, because, even for a researcher, looking at an ENA, you need to explain and you need to make it accessible. So the way that I approached my script, and I owe this to technology because all of my interviews have been through Zoom, so I can read and not let them know that I'm reading. But the script was a great tool for me to organize my thoughts and try to make that explanation. Like Mike used a video, I like the live explanation and sharing because I'm looking at their expressions, and if they have a question, they can just interrupt me right away. So it's a great tool to make it accessible, but also that live sharing with the participants. In my case, because the topic is identity, and I'm showing my participants a network about the things that they have said about themselves. That can be intimidating. So that's why I keep in check the vocabulary that I use. Like the word tension, for instance, that I used in the network, I modified that a little bit when I shared that with them in the script, so that, again, these things are more accessible and are not so overwhelming for them. Typically, it goes really, really well. But I would say what we should worry about or be concerned about is the after the script. Like if you decide to use the script, is the after, the questions that they have and the interaction that they have, and how you can facilitate that interaction with the ENA.
Great, thank you, Hazel and Mike. And Samuel, I think you had your hand up next, if you want to ask your question.
Yeah, I was just wondering, with the 9 codes, where you're showing the stronger and weaker links, are you delving further into what's causing some links to be stronger than the others?
Yeah, so it's a really good question again, Samuel. Thank you. So it's a really interesting component of this process is actually having the teachers, when they're drawing those lines, when they're annotating the visualization, to get them to start to explain why they think things are going to be the way that they are. And then when there's a difference, to actually start to unpack that with them a little bit as well. So one of the things that is a challenge at the moment is not knowing what the teachers are actually going to draw. So to actually have lots of examples on hand to be able to say, well, it's because you talked about this kind of thing, can be difficult. It's one where I found I probably know this data set better than any other that I've probably worked with for that very reason. As the researcher, I feel like I have to be really able to respond to questions that teachers have. So I've got to remember, I've got to know what it was that they said as part of their work. And I think that's also really, for me, an important thing to get to know these people that I'm then going to be working with for a couple of months in this particular course. So I see it as time well invested, but it is a challenge.
Thank you.
Great. And I think before I go to David, I wanted to just check with Anne to see if you got your question answered. I have a little checklist of order. Do you feel like you had your question answered previously? Well, all right. Well, and if you want to reach out again, feel free. Otherwise, David, we'll kick it to you. You're muted.
No, it's the mantra of COVID. First of all, thanks for those are two great presentations. I'm consistently so happy that the quality of presentations in these webinars is high. Makes them fun to attend. And more than that, I want to say that I think that the kind of participatory work that you guys are doing, participatory QE work that you're doing is, if not the most important, I think one of the most important things that's happening in terms of developing both our conceptions of QE and also the QE toolkit. So I'm delighted that you've given this webinar, and also that there's going to be, I'm correct, right, Mike and Hazel, there's actually a SIG and some more discussion at the upcoming conference and so on. So that's super. I wanted to, well, I guess push back a little bit on something that was in well, sort of the kind of concluding musing that Mike made about this question of sort of simplified versus complex. Hazel talked about it as sort of things being accessible and so on. And so of course, one way to reframe that is emic versus edic. But I think the thing I want to push back on is actually that, so my concern about laying out the codes in a circle or an oval or whatever you want. I mean, that's a very traditional network analytic technique. And the reason that we don't do that in ENA and didn't do it, when we were developing it, is that anytime you lay out your nodes in an arbitrary fashion, you create visual and therefore conceptual artifacts, right? So things appear to be, there's this dense cluster of things appear to be moving from or to or whatever it is. And if those things have been laid out in a way that's arbitrary, then you're creating arbitrary artifacts. And if they've been laid out for some purpose, like, oh, it made this network look better or more coherent or whatever, then it's going to make something else look less coherent, right? There's an inherent bias in that layout, one way or the other, whether it's the bias of chance or the bias of intended bias. And so let me throw out a sort of counter proposal for the emic versus edic. And I'm drawing from, so in quantitative methods, they talk about levels of measurement. So there's sort of a nominal level where things just have names and the names just categorize them, but there's no relationships between the categories inherently. And then there's a kind of ordinal level where you could say that, like, somebody finished first, second, or third in the race, but you have no idea how far apart the people were. And then there's the what's sometimes called the ratio or interval level, but it's sort of what we think of as regular quantitative measures, where the measures have meaning, right? The fact that you got a 2 and I got a 3 means that you're 1 ahead of me. And if Hazel got a 1, she is twice as far ahead of me as you are. It's not just an ordering thing, right? And so in a sense, the ENA diagrams as they currently exist are designed to be very mathematically accurate for some particular values of mathematics, right? They're taking those network positions correspond to the positions of the points in space that we're comparing, blah, 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 right? And as a result, it groups codes together that tell us something about either the group overall or pre and post or something like that. So I think that the challenge may be, the challenge that I'm kind of throwing out here is to find a way that doesn't have to basically throw away all of that mathematical precision, but also doesn't have to maintain that mathematical precision at the expense of kind of conceptual clarity. And this is something I've thought about a bit, right? But just to give you an example, right? So one simple thing we could think about doing is place, put a ruler so draw a circle around around all the codes. Okay, put a ruler at the center, right? And draw and pass it through each code and just draw that line. Wherever the code touches the circle, that's where we put it. So it basically just takes the codes and kind of spreads them out around the circle. If you want, you could make the intervals even or whatever, but that would at least preserve that left-right orientation that you have been talking about. We could think of more sophisticated things like leaving some of them at a smaller center in the circle in the center, because those are central for whatever central means, right? But we could think about ways of mathematically transforming the original ENA representation such that it retained some properties. Kind of the same thing as like going from measuring my times in the race to measuring the order of finish. It's not as precise mathematically, but it contains some important information. And we could even actually measure the extent to which the new representation was distorting that underlying model, because we could compute the centroids of the new networks and then do a goodness of fit statistic, blah, 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 blah. But so what I'd like to, so there's a question actually here. So there's a pony inside all this horse manure. And the question is, like, if Zach could build that, or if somebody could build that, would it be useful to you to have that kind of intermediate representation between the kind of precisely mathematical representation and the non-mathematical representation, which you have now? And if so, what would that use be? Like, that's the second part is actually the most interesting question. Like, how would that, in what ways might that change the conversation?
I think,
and that's a question for both of you, by the way, but Mike specifically provoked me.
So I love the way that David says, I've done a little bit of thinking about this, and comes out with that kind of explanation. It's really great to be provoked on this, David, because it's been something that's been troubling me as well. It's like, as part of this process, where do we lose the power of ENA by actually making something a little bit more accessible? And so I think having that, and maybe what I've done as part of this process is actually gone too far down that simplification kind of path. But I think what you're describing is probably more helpful. And one of the things that I was saying in the second or third last slide that I presented was, how do I use ENA with these other kinds of visualizations that we've sort of been playing around with? And I think that's kind of what you're getting at there, is having a mathematically rigorous or more rigorous version of this that still is accessible for participants. And so I think something like that would be really, really powerful, because what it does is it bridges what I have been doing in with both tools, and it brings them together in one. And so the short answer is yes, I think it would be incredibly useful, because it is that bridging tool. It allows people who are maybe who don't have as much time to sit and look at circles and lines as I do, allows them to access and be part of the conversation, but still allows us to make claims that we don't necessarily, we're not able to make with other tools that currently exist.
Yeah, and by the way, when I said I thought a lot about it, I meant that Zach and Cesar and a couple other people in the lab thought a lot about it. And there's actually a teacher interface that uses that sort of a similar idea. Brendan knows more about this, and there's a paper on it too. So I wasn't really inventing it myself, but yeah, I'd be interested to see what comes of it. And Mike, if you didn't see, Goal had a couple of really interesting comments to follow up on that as well. Thank you for musing on that. Hazel, if you had any thoughts,
I think the broader question here is start thinking about what would be the modifications, and what is it that we think as researchers from the tools that we need to preserve for such and such reasons. What are definitely the things that are not non-negotiable, let's say, and which ones are? Because again, this sharing with participants requires that we also change some of the things. So what are the things that we are changing, for what reasons, and what biases go into that modification or that sort of like adaptation of the tools? And this goes for adapting the tools that we already have and thinking about the tools that don't exist yet but will exist. It's a great question, I think, and a great bookmark to really think about, because I'm actually thinking, one of the things that I've been thinking about is the difference between presenting researcher generated codes versus participant generated codes. And again, like, what's the balance there? That's something that I've been thinking, and I welcome ideas for my dissertation because I'm actually putting this puzzle together.
And what might a coding tool look like that facilitated that dialogue too?
Nice. All right, I think Simon's question was next, and if we have time, we'll try to sneak a few more in. I know there's a few others in chat, and we're going to need to be wrapping up soon, so I'll just put that out there, but hopefully we can get to Sylvie had some in the chat, and also Adam, but if not, we can continue these discussions hopefully at ICQE. But Simon, go ahead. I think you were up next.
Thanks, Hazel and Mike. It's so exciting to see this moving forward. So great questions from David there. Just to pick up on that, one of the challenges is not overwhelming the participants too much, because by subtracting detail, we are simplifying. But then the concern is, oh, we've just thrown out some of the DNA of ENA, right? And we want to try and preserve more of that. So it could be that not just color and position, but interactivity with the diagram can be used to layer on more and more complexity. But interactivity allows us to just do that in a gradual way. So that's another way of bringing people in, but it just takes longer to bring them into the conversation with what this thing is telling us, rather than whacking it all in there at once. So that that would be a sort of interactive technique. What I think is so interesting here is we've got this sort of really interesting tension to navigate between confidence in our science, right, which is valuing the etic-emic difference, and humility, which is recognizing that the etic model is always an imperfect abstraction of the real complexity of what we're studying. And one of the key questions perhaps for us thinking about PQ is this something that everybody should be doing all the time in everything they do with ENA or QE in general, or are there particular niches where it's most powerful to use? Now, that's just a sort of big question that no one can answer right now. But I'm just wondering whether there's a very important distinction to make between feeding back to people how they consciously represent themselves, often through interviews at the moment, right? Where it makes absolutely perfect sense to say, what do you think about this mirror I'm holding up to you? Do you want to add some more? Because, we know that people know more than they can say, Polanyi, right? And it seems utterly ridiculous to say, well, you didn't say this in your interview, so I can't code that, right? We're using it to help them fill in the gaps. And that's somewhat different from coding what people do when they're engaged in some less self-conscious behavior, right? So we're not interviewing them about something. They're not talking about themselves. They're just doing something, and we are analyzing that. And we might potentially argue etic has got much more power and authority there, because they might say, oh, when I do this activity, I do this and I do that, and we're going, we're not seeing that, and they're just rationally reconstructing what they believe they do, but actually we're not seeing that. And that's where the etic, scientific, analytic view has more authority, perhaps. So I don't know the answer to that, just a thought.
Great, thank you, Simon. So I think we're gonna, maybe we can sneak this last question in. Then I saw a few questions from Sylvie in the chat. What's the difference between participatory QE and member checking or response validation? And how are you documenting the data and the feedback from those sessions? So I don't know if Mike and Hazel, you have a chance to speak to that really quick. And then I know Adam had a question too. And then also there's a few others in the chat as well. But do you want to take a crack at that, Hazel or Mike, real quick, about how is this different than just member checking versus and or how are you documenting and integrating the data from the feedback sessions?
I think this is like member checking, but it also, I think, is giving people an opportunity not just to check what it is that we're saying, but actually adding new information. So it's actually also, for me, a form of data generation as well. So it's not just checking what it is that we've done, but it's a way to actually be able to generate new understandings. I see it more as a conversation starter rather than necessarily checking on whether I've been able to interpret things correctly or not. one of the challenges, as I've sort of been saying, is how we integrate then all of this data to come up with a coherent kind of narrative. And I think that's one of the next big challenges for me, is to start to think about ways in which we can tell these stories using these different data sets to be able to illustrate certain points. And I think that's a real challenge that I don't have an answer for yet. But maybe one of next year's webinars, we might be able to continue the story and the conversation.
And very briefly, I want to refer to one of Simon's questions about if everyone in QE should be doing this. And I think there's a reason why Mike and I are doing this. And what we have in common is that we're working with, in my case, pre-service teachers, and Mike is working with in-service teachers. So there's a fertile ground there for working with teachers who want to think about their practices and their knowledge. At least from my perspective, it has been a great tool. I'm not sure about other populations, and about, in the case of identity, again, I bring back to like what I study, and it's been very, very useful. Again, I think that's a matter of looking at your population and your purpose in your research, and how you want to interact with both at the same time.
Hazel, that was a great response, and also an amazing segue to what I wanted to say next. So thank you. I think there actually is going to be, outside of the symposium on participatory QE, that these topics are also going to be central to the healthcare symposium that's going to be hosted. If I'm not mistaken, that I think Jamie is part of. Is that correct? I'm seeing some nodding from Jamie, so that makes me feel correct. Excellent. So we're just at time right now. I know Adam had a question too, and maybe some people can hang on a little bit longer if they'd like to. If Adam, if you want to, if Mike and Hazel can hang on, if they don't have to go. But I'd like to take a quick moment to thank our presenters again today and make a few quick announcements. Hendrik, who unfortunately couldn't join us today, will be joining Golnaz Raspor Ergens at the last webinar for the year. And we're talking about developing hubs and labs around QE. So that you'll look out for registration for that. I also want to highlight that participation in ICQE this year is going to be subsidized almost entirely by the National Science Foundation. So unless you're a professor who has come before, you can use a code to get a totally free registration. The National Science Foundation is going to pick it up. So postdocs, graduate students are free. Anyone who's totally new, it will be free. For those of you who have come before, the National Science Foundation will pick up everything but $50 of your tab. So that's a fantastic thing. Look for that information. We're trying to get as many new people into our community as we can. So please share this information. If you know someone who likes free and amazing things, let them know about it. Also, I'd like to point out that there's going to be a online QE accelerator. There's going to be a slightly more in-depth thing for people that are new to QE, that there's announcements that are just starting to go out around that. Again, that's something that is being sponsored generously by the National Science Foundation. It will be led, actually some of the facilitators are here right now, Hazel, Rogers, Jayoon, and who am I forgetting right now? Sylvie, myself, and there's one other person I'm blanking on. But they're also going to be facilitating that. So please feel free to look out for that and share that with people as well. It's another exciting opportunity. So I just want to say thank you again to everyone. And it's in some ways a great thing that we still have questions. Leanne was the person that asked before. She wanted to know, how do you feel when someone wants to change your codes as a researcher? I think those are, and Adam had a question. I would like us to hopefully be able to continue these discussions within the SIG and at the conference. So just thanks again to our presenters and everyone else for spending their time and sharing in discussion with us. It's fantastic. So thank you all again. We're officially done. If you can and would like to hang out a little bit longer, feel free, but this is the end of our regularly scheduled program. Thanks, everyone.